Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 87. General Platov, commander of the Cossacks. This episode is sponsored by NapoleonicImpressions.com, featuring unique gifts inspired by the Napoleonic Wars. When you go to the site, you'll find coffee mugs, posters, Christmas ornaments, t-shirts, and all kinds of souvenirs from the Napoleonic era. Again, the website is NapoleonicImpressions.com. Now, on with the show. Very excited because I have one of my favorite guests, Josh Provan, on the line. Hello, Josh.
Hi, John.
How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Very
All right.
excited to talk about the gentleman today.
Yeah, we're talking about a famous Cossack general, Matvei Platov. Is that right?
I believe so. Although all the people I know who can actually speak Russian will at this moment be probably telling me that I'm leading you down the wrong path. But we'll just go with it.
All right, we'll just go with it. Before we jump in, I want to let my listeners know a little bit about Josh. He has a couple things going. He has a great YouTube page called Adventures in Historyland, which I recommend. He also has a new book out called Every Hazard and Fatigue, The Siege of Pensacola. And where can my listeners find this great book?
Well, listeners in the UK can get it from Helion and Company website, which is the main publisher. Of course, it's on Amazon, though, as well, and you can also order it through your local bookstore. And that might be especially pertinent for your US listeners who may not want to pay import fees, because I believe it comes from the UK. Although they may have a US distributor through Casemate Publishing, so check that website out as well.
Okay. And just quickly, for my American listeners, it's about the Siege of Pensacola here in the United States during the Revolutionary War. What was so unique about that siege?
It's unique because it is the penultimate campaign of the Spanish effort in the American Revolution, led by a fantastic Spanish general by the name of Bernardo de Galvez. And it is the longest siege of the American Revolution in North America.
And I think a lot of people don't know too much about the Spanish involvement, so I think that'd be a good book to learn to start with.
I hope so.
Getting back to our main topic here, let's discuss Mr. Platov. Where was he born?
Platov was born in a place called Starocharkassk, which is now called something like Starocherkasskaya, which is in the Rostov region, sort of in the Russian Caucasus, and it is the heartland of the Don Cossack host. He was born to a local family, which I don't think was particularly prominent or in any particular respect. So he comes from Cossack country. Okay.
Yeah, he's born in August 1753, and he begins his military service pretty quickly in 1766. Do we know a lot about his early days?
We know bits and bobs. I've seen birth dates in August, going back as early as 1751. But he was obviously, as I said, he's born in Cossack country, and his father may have been a sergeant in the army, so he learned about soldiering fairly early on, and I think it is not really debated that he was always going to follow the traditional route of Cossack boys and of his generation to go and fight in the Tsar's army. So, all Cossack boys began training early, and obviously he, like you say, he started his career very early as well when he was a young teenager. So he must have had a fairly typical Cossack upbringing.
Yeah, let's talk about the term Cossacks, because we heard a lot, especially in this age. We heard all the way up to the Russian Revolution in 1917 there. Let's kind of talk about their background, because Napoleon once said, quote, "The Cossacks are the best light troops that exist. If I had them in my army,
I would go all the way around the world with them. How did the Cossacks originate, and why were they such terrific cavalrymen?
Well, it's quite a it's an excellent question. It's quite a long answer. So strap yourselves in.
All
But
right.
no, it's interesting actually. Napoleon did have some Cossacks in his army for a very short time. Actually, I don't know very much about them, but I know there was a Cossack regiment. He tried, much like the Mamluks, but it didn't really stick. And it's interesting as well that that quote must have been inspired from when Napoleon interrogated a captured Cossack in 1812. And the story goes that he asked the fellow what he thought of Cossacks serving in the French army. And the Cossack replied that if Cossacks served Napoleon, he would have conquered the world. So that gives you a certain sense about, what the Cossacks thought of themselves.
Right.
And there is a certain amount of self-promotion with Cossack stuff. They were not shy people. But the Cossacks were a nomadic people who originated from the Eurasian steppe. There isn't just one sort of Cossack, and in this period you had Bashkir Cossacks, who by the 19th century looked pretty much like Mongols still, and still fought with bows. You had Black Sea Cossacks, the Cossacks of the Bug River, the Urals, and the most famous came from the Don, like Platov did. They became famous for their resistance to both the Tsar and the Sultan of the Ottoman Turks in the 17th century. And in that time, they began to be incorporated into the Russian Empire. And from that point onwards, their nomadic ways sort of became more and more traditional. And many bands or hosts of Cossacks were settled by the Tsar in communities along the border of Russia. Which gave rise to these larger groups being known as the Cossacks of the Line, the line of the border. So they still had strong nomadic horse traditions, and these were kept up by these Cossack communities, which meant that children were expert horsemen practically from birth. And unlike regular cavalry, who are often just ordinary people who were they were taught to ride, like farmers who were taught to ride, or like clerks and stuff. The Cossacks could still claim a culture still based on living with horses. The horses themselves were like small, ragged-looking ponies, and some bloodlines were certainly from a type of horse probably called an akhalteke. And this meant that they needed very little food, little water, and could carry heavy loads all day without tiring. And no army in Europe could boast of a unit that was so specialized to mounted irregular and regular warfare. I think these are main points that make them such good horsemen, and sort of it's a tradition.
Yeah, and I think we'll come back to that later during the Russian invasion. But it sounds like they were just almost like mountain men who could survive where no one else could. Like they knew how to train their horses to survive. They could survive in the elements for years on end, and where most people could not.
Yes, I think so. This is a key thing as well. They still lived in a fairly rural areas, and they were hardy still. They had yet to be fully sort of urbanized, as you might call it, which they did become as time went on. At this point, there's still a bit of wildness with the Cossacks.
Yeah, and then I think this is actually a good time to come back to Platov. He begins his military service, as I said, in 1766. And 3 years later, he's already a local chief. And you talked a bit earlier about, the boldness and the audaciousness of Cossacks. What leadership skills do you think he had? Because I know later when they meet Marshal Murat, they think he's, like this crazy guy, but they admire his boldness because he's, always at the front lines.
Yeah, the relationship between the Cossacks and Murat is wonderful. That they used to cheer him and things like that is hilarious. And myself and our mutual friend Jimmy Chen cooked up an alternate history where Murat is captured and is made like a a leader of a Cossack host or something like that, and then eventually a king of Poland or something.
I can see that. Yeah.
But yeah, Platov, back to the real world. Yeah, he's made what is called a Yesol in 1769, which is a Cossack rank equivalent to that of a captain. So he's definitely a skilled rider, a brave fighter, and a popular young man, because he was recommended for the rank by the commander of the Russian Second Army during the Russo-Turkish War of 1768, 1774. The Prince Mikhail Vladimirovich Dolgorukov. So he certainly stood out as someone special.
Yeah. And he performs well on the campaigns in Crimea, and by 1772, he's commanding a Cossack regiment. Russia was involved in a lot of wars during these times, correct?
Yes, they were definitely. It was a time of still continuing expansion, especially towards the Caucasus and in the Urals, and towards the Middle East as well, under Catherine the Great. Specifically for Platov, it is the Russo-Turkish War that I mentioned earlier, and that sees the Crimean Khanate become a Russian dependency, which was annexed in 1783, which sparked another war with the Ottomans in 1787, in which Suvorov and Rumyantsev delivered a severe pasting to the Sultan's armies. But you also have several wars of rebellion, which was such as the war with the Bar, Pugachev's rebellion, which is actually a Cossack rising on the Volga and in the Urals between 1773 and 1775. So plenty of opportunity for young officers to make their names.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, he was serving under Suvorov, and he receives a lot of awards for his achievements. And by 1793, he's risen to major general. So this Platov, he's really, I guess, an exceptional guy at this point.
Yeah, he's like we said before, he's definitely someone that generals seem to take notice of, and someone who is prominent enough in what he does that you notice him. Like you said, he's awarded a lot of decorations. He's got the Order of St. George twice in the second and third classes. He's been made Ataman of the Ekaterinoslav and Chuguev Cossacks, and an Ataman means he's now their leader and representative. After being made Major General, he participated in the Persian War. He was awarded the Cross of St. Vladimir and even a golden sword for courage. So he's certainly not slowing down in any way.
Yeah. We'll talk about, I mean, this guy is basically going to become a world traveler, but he's already all over the Russian Empire. So it sounds like wherever there's a war, they want Platov there with his Cossacks.
Yeah, wherever there's a war, you need the Cossacks, and it's the Cossacks, and by this point, the Russians have properly incorporated them into the empire, and so they're just so useful for the type of warfare that the Russians conduct, that wherever there is a war, they want the Cossacks.
Yeah, and not just for actual fighting, but for scouting and reconnaissance and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. However, he is disgraced by new Tsar Paul I and exiled to Kostroma, and he's briefly imprisoned. But Tsar Paul was kind of eliminating a lot of generals at this point. But the Tsar later places him in charge of the 1800 expedition to India. And I've heard about this. I think this was in partnership with Napoleon, correct? What do we know about this ill-conceived campaign?
Yeah, it was a crazy mad idea that was cooked up by Paul after he became disillusioned with the Allied coalitions after 1800. So Suvorov did amazing things in 1799, and then he felt the Austrians let him down, and the coalition had pretty much fallen apart after Marengo. So Paul was basically saying, I want to make friends with the French. What's the best way to make friends with the French? Attack the British. The easiest way I can attack the British is to attack India, and I have lots of Cossacks I can send to do that. So that was the plan. It was cooked up to be like an equal sized army of 2 corps from Russia and 2 corps from France, and they were supposed to go down into the Caucasus and unite somewhere just on the verge of the Persian Empire, and basically march through that in Afghanistan and then hit India.
Right.
So you can see that it wasn't a brilliant scheme, but it served to sort of smooth diplomatic relations between Russia and France at the time, and Napoleon was happy to sort of entertain it. And then, of course, some dodgy dealings happened in St. Petersburg, which meant that it never happened. Platov was ostensibly given command of the Cossacks on that march after he'd been released. In fairness to Paul, Paul was a very, and rightly so in some cases, a very suspicious guy. And it was easy, therefore, for his courtiers to get other people in trouble. And basically, Platov got denounced, and so he was arrested. But Paul did give him a fair trial. And when he found out that the charges were spurious, he let him out and he gave him another decoration and said, invade India for me.
Right, but as we mentioned, that invasion didn't get very far. And then not long after, Tsar Paul himself is killed by a group of generals and is replaced by his son, Tsar Alexander. And Platov is made Ataman of the Don Cossacks, which is a pretty lofty position, correct?
Yes, he's made first of all campaign Ataman of the Don host in 1801, and he remains their Ataman pretty much until he dies. It gives him the authority to do. He governs them now. He's their leader. He gives him the authority to reorganize their society a little and to even move the capital to Novocherkassk, which is, I believe, where there's some statues of Platov to this day, and a university he founded.
Well, in 1807, Platov was commanding a corps of Cossacks that fight the French in the battles of Eylau, Gstaad, and Friedland. And he's again showered with awards for his performance in these battles. And I know Napoleon, he had Murat, he had Bessier, he had a lot of really good cavalrymen, but why were the Cossacks such a nuisance to Napoleon's armies?
I feel like there's some wonderful quotes from French cavalry officers that will probably explain that better than I can, but it's basically because the Cossacks are specialists at what they do. So back in the day, most Eastern European armies had irregular cavalry who came along for loot and such. But as all conventional European armies in the early 19th century have switched to more regular cavalry establishments and whatnot, and because the light cavalry are meant to fulfill the roles of scouts, messengers, and guards, as well as fighting in battle, it wasn't considered necessary to use irregulars anymore. But Russia retained their irregulars, and they operated with a distinctly peculiar combat ethos, which was never to fight anything that was equal in numbers to you unless you actually had to. And in fact, they acted as if they were a sort of predator, always attacking the point of least resistance and maximum weakness, and fleeing when attacked in return.
Right.
And they would usually come back later from a different direction. They were absolutely indispensable as scouts and superb in mixed columns of raiders and partisans that you get in 1812 and 13 and stuff like that. They do this better because it's part of just what they like. A line cavalryman is a specialist at keeping discipline. They can do scouting as well. They just can't do it as effectively as the Cossacks can. So they're highly respected by their enemies, feared by them as well. I mean, honestly, the Polish regarded them with a mixture of respect and disdain, but that's for different reasons. The French dreaded them, as if they were some kind of Slavic centaurs that could materialize from the woods and plains and then vanish.
Yeah, I've read that. They would usually, like, if infantry formed up and fired at them, they would flee. But and they'd come back, like you said, from another direction. And I think that must have been stressful. If you're a French soldier and you're marching and you're tired and you're trying to get some rest, but you're always on guard for these Cossacks to show up, it'd be very hard to relax at any point.
I think so. I think if morale is a big part of a battle or a campaign, and it is, the Cossacks had a massive effect on it because once a consciousness of them is placed in the minds of your soldiers, you're always going to be, like you say, a little wary that you can't go very far in search of forage. Otherwise, the Cossacks will get you, and they would.
Right.
And that means you have to labor a lot more men and effort in foraging parties to go and do stuff. Otherwise, to like prevent the Cossacks from attacking you. So their very presence against you affects the way that you conduct a campaign.
Right. Well, let's discuss Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia. We know that, it's been said that the Russian plan overall was to draw Napoleon and his army deeper and deeper into Russia. What was the role of Platov and his Cossacks?
To begin with, the role of the Cossacks is to harass the enemy advance guard, to slow it down, and to gather as much information as possible, while denying the enemy the ability to gather their own information. So very classic light cavalry outpost stuff. I believe that Platov is attached to, I think it's Bagration's army, and when the retreat begins, Bagration's retreat begins because the two armies are separated at that point. The job is essentially the same, only they have to be more careful. They don't get isolated and cut off by the very numerous French cavalry. But the Cossacks were very difficult to catch. And in those early maneuvers, Platov sort of reinforced his and his men's appearance as almost supernatural phantoms to the French. No one knew where his men might appear from. And in one raid, he captured and drove off most of the French cavalry remounts when fresh horses were already a big problem for Napoleon.
Yeah, I know early in the campaign, Platov wins a minor victory in August against General Sebastiani's cavalry at the Battle of Inkovo. Do you know anything about this battle?
It's, I think it's part of the series of actions which get sort of lumped into a battle between Inkovo and the place called Mir. Platov actually wins a number of cavalry actions through the campaign, and this is sort of his most famous one. There's a painting of it and everything. So that it was also mostly against Polish cavalry, and the Cossacks were always very proud whenever they could defeat the Polish. Although the Polish insist they weren't defeated, there was just too many Cossacks, and that they chose to retreat. It's the sort of thing.
Redeploy career.
Yeah, exactly. But the Platov sees an opportunity to attack and isolate the advance guard when it gets a little ahead of itself. He gives it a bit of a hammering, and then when reinforcements come up, he does the Cossack thing and runs away.
Yeah,
he gets pursued, and I believe he gets pursued for a fair distance, to be honest. And then again, once the enemy is strung out again, he attacks. And that's the point when the French either choose to retreat, depending on the source, or are forced to retreat. And this is very... Platov was now somewhere in his 50s, and it's one of the first victories the Russian army hears about. So that's a big deal.
Right.
And he handled his troops very well and showed an excellent understanding of mounted warfare. Like over a very long distance, he kept control and fought well. It's actually very quite typically as if he had studied Mongol tactics, where when you are threatened by superior force, you run away, so the enemy spreads out, and then you turn around and you attack and bite bits off them.
Yeah, and I was reading, the Cossacks really knew how to take care of their horses. They were properly fed and shod for icy roads. And I remember reading Murat was kind of wearing out his horses chasing after these Cossacks.
Oh yes, absolutely. The French cavalry had already lost thousands of horses before they even crossed into Russian territory. The Polish were beside themselves with trying to figure out what Napoleon was trying to do with horses dropping by the hundreds every day.
Mm-hmm.
And the danger of fighting concentrations of Cossacks as commanded by Platov is shown because Murat almost got captured because he attacked too forcefully, got surrounded, and then had to be extricated by a regiment of Polish lancers.
Yeah. It just it sounds like, having properly trained ponies, as you said, they're lighter, they can spring in and out of actions where the French are on these big Prussian horses that maybe weren't suitable for the environment.
Yeah, it is definitely a problem, especially in this sort of the cavalry warfare that exists outside of the major strategic kind of grand strategy.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big problem if the enemy's horses just outperform yours at every turn.
Yeah. Well, Platov fights in the bloody Battle of Borodino, which was the fight outside of Moscow before the French occupied it. And it was said that he attempted a flanking maneuver that caused Napoleon to hold back his Imperial Guard at the crucial moment. Now, we've heard a dozen stories about why Napoleon had held the Imperial Guard back, that Marshal Bessier said he was, many leagues away from Paris and he shouldn't give up his best troops. It was said Napoleon was sick at the time. But I didn't know about this flanking maneuver that Platov might have caused Napoleon to hold back to see what was going on there. Is that true?
Partially, I mean, there was absolutely a flanking attack by the Cossacks and the Russian cavalry, and it may well have contributed to Napoleon's worry about how many men he had left, fit and able to fight a continuing campaign or something like that. Because, so the Cossacks, I'll tell you about it. The Cossacks are out on the right flank of the Russian army at Borodino. And generally speaking, they're to some extent attached to General Uvarov's First Cavalry Corps, which is also on the right. Through the early part of the fighting, Platov's men had been scouting the Kalachar River, which flows down past Borodino and the center of the Russian line. And then at about 4 p.m., French pressure was building on this Russian center at what they called the Raevsky Redoubt.
Mm-hmm.
And it looked like one more attack from Prince Eugene's corps would break the Russian defenses. Just before this, Platov had been given permission to cross the river and harass the French rear. There was no particular plan involved. Platov had found a way across. A staff officer named von Toll had basically pleaded the case to Kutuzov, and Kutuzov just sort of, without thinking, said, "Yeah, go on, have a go, whatever."
Yeah.
So Platov gets the order to attack, but it's then thought that somebody thinks that actually this might be a bit bigger opportunity than we think, so let's send the cavalry corps with the Cossacks and make a big show of this.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, nobody thought to send any infantry with them. So you get just almost about 8,000 Russian cavalry now riding around the French left flank and approaching their rear, because they go right round it, and then they're just sort of in this void behind the French left, and they're sort of approaching the rear center.
Mm-hmm.
And the French are preparing to attack the Raevsky Redoubt, and then suddenly someone spots just hordes of Russian cavalry moving around where they shouldn't be, and somebody obviously recognizes that there are Cossacks with them.
Mm-hmm.
And this just paralyzes the French completely.
Mm-hmm.
And all troops that are available are then rushed to the left flank to stave off this attack, because Uvarov and Platov, they get there and they realize, okay, we're on our own. We're on our own. We're all cavalry. The most we can probably do here, because that's a lot of infantry out there, is raid some is raid the baggage train or something like that.
Right.
And when the French infantry turn around and try to fight them, they obligingly charge a few squares, but they don't really do much. However, what they do achieve is to occupy the French for about like 1.5 to 2 hours. So by this point, the Russian center has been able to reorganize, and
Right.
Napoleon's army's been doing nothing except getting hammered by artillery.
Mhm.
So this audacious raid did really rattle the French, and I believe Napoleon himself,
Mhm.
who remained almost entirely inactive through the entire battle.
Right.
The one time he got on his horse to go and see what was going on was when he heard that the Cossacks were around the flank. So it didn't physically stop the Imperial Guard marching, because that came later after the redoubt was taken.
Right.
And in fact, the Russians all thought that this was a big waste of time, like a waste of, effort, really, because nothing happened
Mhm.
from what they could see. And it took ages, it took until after the war for people to figure out that actually this cavalry raid prevented the battle ending 2 hours earlier than it did.
Right. Right. And
So
it gave the Russian infantry probably a little bit of a respite while the French were figuring this stuff out.
yeah, absolutely. And we don't know. I mean, it could have been a factor in Napoleon's mind
Mhm.
for why he didn't commit the guard.
Yeah,
I personally am in the camp that actually he made the right decision.
I agree.
So
Yeah. And we'll come back to why I agree here in a second. So yeah, he captures Moscow, and then after a few weeks, he has to retreat from Moscow and out of Russia. And the Cossacks are constantly raiding Napoleon's army, capturing stragglers, and not letting the Grand Army rest. And I think this is why you needed the Imperial Guard, basically just to get him out of Russia, correct?
yeah, kind of. I mean, you had a lot of elements of the army that are still working as
Mm.
they leave Moscow.
Mhm.
They've lost a lot of cavalry. The Russians have scored some victories against Murat um, just before they left, and so, for instance, the Polish become basically the cavalry arm because they're the only ones who have managed to save their horses.
Mhm.
And so many thousands of horses were lost at Borodino as well, which was a
Right.
big problem. And Napoleon does need did need the guard to sort of keep the army together, because Davout's corps was still there to some extent,
Mhm.
as was Eugene's corps,
Mhm.
which were both considered very tough units, and it hadn't been quite so badly mauled as some of the others. Uh, Unfortunately, uh, they don't really remain that way, but the guard does. So,
Right.
for instance, the the partisan columns, like you say, which are made up of Cossacks, Hussars, Uhlans, Dragoons, and light troops, are operating on the flanks of the
Mhm.
retreating French columns after a certain point. I don't think it's as early as immediately leaving Moscow, but that's what happens. And then at the Battle of Vyazma, which is I think it's just before Smolensk, they get back to Smolensk.
Mhm.
Platov, Miloradovich, and Paskevich defeat Davout and the First Corps,
Right.
and it has to be saved from utter destruction by Eugene.
Mhm.
And Caulaincourt credited the defeat of the First Corps as the moment when discipline in the Grande Armée began to crumble. So he absolutely needed the guard.
Mhm. Yeah, and there's that famous quote. I think it's from Davidov, where the Imperial Guard went through the Russians like is it a 100-gun ship through fishing skiffs or something like that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's something like that. Davidov is a great memoirist, and he talks about Platov a fair bit as well.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, it must have been hard for the French units to stop and rest with Cossacks on the prowl. And the Russian army, General Bennigsen stated, quote, "They exploit the tiniest enemy blunder and immediately make the enemy regret it," end quote. So I thought that kind of sums up what it must have been like on the retreat. Like, you can't rest, you can't make a mistake, you have to keep sharp, otherwise the Cossacks will will either capture you or kill you. So I can't imagine the stress.
It must have been terrible,
Yeah.
especially with resources so in demand, and you need to go and forage, but you can't really, because what hasn't been destroyed is, being guarded by unseen eyes, so to speak, and they'll pounce on you as soon as you leave the safety of the columns. And Davidov talks about the thousands of prisoners that they were pulling in every week.
Mm-hmm.
So it's I think the Cossacks definitely retained their, when things go, like Bennington said, when things go bad, it's multiplied by the fact the Cossacks are there.
Yeah, and Napoleon makes it out of Russia, and in 1813, Platov and his Cossacks are also fighting in liberation of Germany in the 1813 Battle of Leipzig, and Platov himself wins a smaller action at the Battle of Altenburg. And I'm not sure if this is true, but I wanted to ask you, once Napoleon was kind of fighting for his life, were the Cossacks among the first enemy troops to enter Paris in 1814?
I wouldn't be at all surprised if they were, because they were usually out well in advance of the rest of the army. So even if it wasn't officially recognized that they were the first in, they probably were.
Yeah.
I think there is some sort of argument about who gets the honor of being the first into Paris, but it's probably the Cossacks, right? I mean, they behave very well, however, I should say, towards civilians throughout these campaigns in Germany and France.
Mm-hmm.
And it's even thought that the word bistro comes into the French language through their habit of asking for food quickly when they were in Paris.
I didn't know that. There you go, bistro.
Yeah, in Russian, if they to ask for something fast, I believe you say bistra,
Mm-hmm.
and the French changed that into bistro.
That's funny. Yeah, and after Napoleon's downfall, I think this part is amazing. Platov accompanies Tsar Alexander on a trip to London, where he is again showered with awards, including an honorary doctorate from Oxford. Now, think about where this guy began. And he just went to Paris, London, and got a doctorate from Oxford. What an amazing journey for this guy, don't you think?
It's absolutely mind-boggling, to be honest. I mean, most Europeans considered Cossacks a sort of a species of Russian peasant. Mm-hmm. So that is an immense arc for a man like Platov. And it's a kind of an interestingly 18th century story as well. Platov is from Catherine the Great's age, Mm-hmm. And his life seems to be a sort of one that defies the popular perception of how a man could rise based on merit alone in the Ancien Regime, because that's really, I mean, maybe if we dig deeper into Russian sources, I don't know, but from what we have, it seems like he did rise basically through merit and connections to where he got to. And there are portraits of him across some of the palaces in Britain, because everybody absolutely adored Platov and his Cossacks, because he brought over some of his Cossacks, and they camped in Hyde Park. And people love to visit the Cossack encampment in Hyde Park.
I've been to Hyde Park. I had no idea about that. That's hilarious.
Yeah. It was a big thing. It was a big draw, and Cossack fever spread across fashionable London. Everybody wanted to wear Circassian trousers and, grow their hair a bit and wear furry hats.
That's amazing. I had no idea. Well, our legendary hero unfortunately dies a few years later in 1818 at the age of 67, probably just from years of hard living and hard drinking. What do you think his legacy is?
He's a true legend in Russia. Has been for a very long time, and certainly amongst Cossack communities still to this day. He is a legend, very very kind of mythologized to some extent, both by Russian historians, sort of folk histories, and indeed Western histories who are sort of enamored by the Cossacks, because they're a particular type of soldier that they're easy to admire, and so you can sometimes give them too much credit, But in Napoleonic circles as well, they're very unique, so they draw a lot of attention. And in Napoleonic circles, Platov's name is quite well known. But as we've said through this this talk here, not a lot of people know very much about him as a man or a commander, just because so much written about him is still in Russian. But he is probably one of, if not my ultimate favorite Russian general of the Napoleonic Wars, perhaps. Maybe I'm just a sucker for the legend, but it's a good legend.
It is, and one of the things I liked about Napoleon is like even generals who gave him fits, like Blucher or Benningsen or Kutuzov or Platov, you know, he always respected these guys, you know, even though they constantly foiled his plans.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about Platov is that Platov, because of the curious position that the Cossacks held in the Russian army, never commands an army the way like Blucher did, or Bagration did, or Barclay did, or any of these people who actually went toe to toe with Napoleon. But Platov is given almost as much credit as if he did, just because the Cossacks became such a focal point of what defeated Napoleon in Russia. If you look at that movie, for instance, the invasion of Russia scene is completely dominated by what appears to be like Cossack forest ninjas.
Right. Killing Frenchmen and hammering them into trees.
Yeah, exactly. And that bears little resemblance really to what like the Cossacks would really do, because I mean we could extend this a whole great deal, but basically if you read Davidov, you'll see that they really wanted live prisoners. But nevertheless, that the fear, like that aura that Scott gave the Cossacks in this ridiculous big hats and little movable artillery, is absolutely like real. That is the fear that these demonic sort of shades of the Russian wasteland are exactly the thing that the average French infantry feared the most.
Yeah, I thought the hit and run tactic, where in the movie they basically, like you said, with the little mortars, and they attack, and then Ney and his guys show up, and they've like disappeared. And I thought that was pretty accurate, just the disappearing aspect of it.
I'd have liked them to have given them more horses, because why don't they have horses? But I think there could be a movie about these kind of awesome, like the sort of the awesomeness of the characterization of those Cossacks is probably something you could do like you base a movie around. Jack Sparrow type Cossack.
Absolutely. Well, Josh, appreciate that overview. That was good stuff on Platov and the Cossacks. And again, I'd like to give a shout out. You can find Josh's book, Every Hazard and Fatigue, Siege of Pensacola, on Amazon or wherever books are sold. And I also recommend his YouTube page, Adventures in Historyland, correct?
That is correct. Yes, you can find me there, and drop by, say hello on any of the social media channels as well.
Yeah.
On Twitter /X,
Yep.
And I'll be delighted to say hi.
Yeah, appreciate it, bud. Well, as always, we thank you for your time, and we'll talk soon.